Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for another monthly installment. This is another great interview we have lined up from the Reasonable Faith organization. The international directors are still working through the Blackwell's Companion to Natural Theology. And in chapter 6, The Argument from Reason, that essay was written by none other than Dr. Victor Reppert. And I'm going to spend some time quickly covering his very, very long, the man is very accomplished, but a few things that he's done. Dr. Victor has a Ph.D. in philosophy from the University of Illinois. He has his first master's was in philosophy from Arizona State. His second master's was from Chandler School of Theology from Emory University.
Actually, I went to Chandler first and then ASU next. Yeah.
Very good, sir. Very good. His bachelor's was from Arizona State. This is a very, very gifted man, and he is speaking with us today on the argument from reason. So without further ado, turn it over to you, Doctor.
Did you just do JP's chapter in chapter? Have you done chapter 5 already?
We did. Yes, sir.
You just did chapter 5. Okay. Yeah. I often end up in these volumes with JP does the argument from consciousness, and I do the argument from reason, and that often they're very closely related to one another. I think there is what. Let me explain one difference. Technically, you could say the argument from reason has a kind of kicker to it that arguments from consciousness don't have. And that's this. People, basically what people say, some of the people, at least in the hardcore end of the naturalistic spectrum, in dealing with consciousness, say things like, well, that's a user illusion. That isn't really there. That's, you're just describing this consciousness, and it doesn't really, there isn't real, for example, Daniel Dennett wrote a book called Consciousness Explained, right? And people look at it and say, actually what it looks like is consciousness explained away. Right? What you're doing is what we typically think of as consciousness doesn't actually exist at all. Okay. And so how do you argue with that? Because they're basically taking your basic data and say, for example, you can take an argument for morality, for example. Well, okay, there are certain moral truths. Everyone seems to, or at least implicitly acknowledges them, but somebody can come along and say, oh, those are just subjective. They're just, act. Well, when you get to reason, the people who are naturalists say we reach our positions by reasoning. You look at, for example, Richard Dawkins, when he does his TED talk, or writes the God Delusion, or writes this little open letter to his daughter, right? He said, well, one thing you got to do, I'm not going to tell you what to agree with me about anything, but one thing I really want you to get through your head is that what you believe has to be based on evidence. Well, Richard, guess what you just did? You just presupposed that you have a mind that can be affected by evidence, didn't you? Okay, right? So you can't say that you can reason, that you can take one fact and draw some other conclusion based on that fact on the basis of some kind of rules of evidence or logic or whatever, right? Okay. So you can't. So when I point to reasoning as a fact that you're having trouble explaining as a naturalist, you can't say that isn't really there. That's just subjective. That's not something we really have to explain. You can't do that because then you can't tell your daughter you got to base your beliefs on reasoning. On evidence, right? Because once you use that word evidence, what you're saying is that there is what we in philosophy call mental causation, okay? There is one mental event causing another mental event in virtue of some sort of logical and evidential relations that exist. And you can't you can't get out of that without slicing your throat. Okay, so that's the difference between the argument. That's where maybe there's a little difference between the argument from consciousness and the argument from reason. Some people say, well, the argument from reason is just the argument from consciousness or just a version of it. Yeah, but you got to deal with this fact, at least with respect to some responses to the whole issue of consciousness. The naturalist can't get out and say, oh, well, that's not real. We can explain that away. Can't do that because that's the very basis on which you are founding your entire thesis, right? Scientific naturalist or materialist says, what's great about a materialistic worldview is that it allows us to view the world in a scientific way from top to bottom, okay? That we're following the science when we are being materialists. Well, if my argument is correct, you are not following the science, you are undermining the science. You are, in fact, wiping the science out and sponging it off the slate. And so the claim is that scientific materialism, at least, is, I would make the argument, self-refuting. That is to say, if it's true, you can't be doing the science that you think you're doing. And your position is, in fact, baseless. In fact, the very fact that you have a position is something that you don't really have an explanation for. All right. So anyway, I wanted to kind of get that shot out of the way there. That's kind of how the difference, since you just did the argument from consciousness, I want to kind of connect the two. They're closely related, but on my view, the argument from reason has a kicker. Okay, where if the naturalist wants to go super basically limitativist, they're going to be, let's say, behaviorists. That's going to cause a problem. Now, historically, there is a history of the argument. At one time in history, the argument, I think, got famous. It has been out there for centuries. I believe it's used in, but on the other hand, materialism hasn't been prevalent for centuries. I mean, it's really since Darwin that people, there was things like Holbach, there's Hobbes. My guess is that this line of argument was probably used against Thomas Hobbes by the Cambridge Platonists. I remember seeing something like that in Ralph Cudworth's writings, of all people. Probably most people never heard of Cudworth, but I did look into him. I did look around. I thought there was some, but it's been a long time since I actually looked at it. There were some 18th century materialists, but they were tripping over a problem, namely, well, isn't it just obvious that that critters, we have a bunch of very complex critters out there. They don't seem to be, being very, it's hard to explain their prevalence and so forth. And then Darwin comes along and says, I can basically take what looks like design and purpose, and I can analyze it in terms of in a bottom-up manner through random chance, by random variation, natural selection. Of course, he didn't have any sense of exactly how variation took place, right? But then Mendel comes along and develops genetic theory, and then they mix the two, and you start to get evolutionary biology, which at least promises or offers to provide as bottom-up analysis of everything. Well, can it also analyze the mind? Is the mind simply, in the last analysis, just matter bopping around? Okay. And interestingly enough, there was a very dedicated evolutionary biologist, a thoroughgoing atheist by the name of J.B.S. Haldane. And in 1927, J.B.S. Haldane was considering the question, well, I don't believe in God or anything like that, but is maybe materialism true? And he concluded, no, I can't believe in materialism, because if my thoughts are produced by the motions of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to believe that my brain is composed of atoms. So he basically said that if it's due to physical matter moving, if my mind is really material, then my belief that materialism is true is undermined, okay? And therefore, in spite of being a militant atheist, J.B.S. Haldane says, I cannot be a materialist. This is 1927, okay? And before Lewis comes along, there are a number of philosophers who have defended this general line of argument. Arthur Balfour is one, but there was also a guy by the name of J.B. Pratt, another guy by the name of Wilbur Marshall Urban, another guy by the name of A.E. Taylor. So this is an argument that had been out there for a long time, okay? And it also was an argument that C.S. Lewis was originally kind of a materialist. But he decided to, he read Bertrand Russell's A Free Man's Worship as a good expression of the kind of position that he wanted to adopt. And it basically said, well, reason discovers the truth. We have genuine moral. We know genuine moral truths. There were books that said there are aesthetically, genuinely beautiful, more beautiful and less beautiful things, and so forth. And so that was the position he adopted. And then his buddy Owen Barfield came along and said, "That's an incoherent position, buddy. If you are really going to seriously take this materialist view of the world is just physics, and and that the rock bottom reality is what the senses discover, then what you're really going to have to end up taking is a behaviorist view of reason, of morality, which basically reduces all of that." And Russell and so Russell's position is incoherent, and Lewis becomes convinced that that's true. Now he doesn't turn around and become a theist or a Christian. He becomes something called an absolute idealist, where the world is as ideal. Where in other words, the idea of blind matter bopping around in the world, well, that actually isn't really true. There's really isn't blind matter. It just looks that way to us. And what is really there is the absolute spirit. Okay, and that was the position. So Lewis had a viewpoint that he had an attitude toward. At that point, of course, he wasn't somebody who was wanting to do Christian apologetics. He was somebody who was trying to get away from God as far as he possibly could. He was very much possessed of what Thomas Nagel would later describe as the fear of religion. If you know Thomas Nagel in The Last Word, Thomas Nagel is the bad boy of atheists. He's an atheist, but he takes positions that are that in fact seem to be much more like theists than atheists on a lot of issues. And the people like Dennett are very upset. They're very upset with his, because and actually I think he's got a version of my argument here. It's just he doesn't want to draw any theistic conclusions from it. Well, I do. It's fascinating. But there's a lot of similarity between C.S. Lewis prior to his conversion and Thomas Nagel today, because C.S. Lewis prior to his conversion sees these problems with this materialistic view of the world, but he doesn't want to believe in God. He really hates the idea of believing in God, or having somebody he says, and so he goes, he buys in on this absolute spirit. This is a non-personal this is a godlike being, but it's very non-personal, and you don't have to obey it. You don't have to fear anybody, and you really, especially great is you don't have to obey anybody. You know?
Right.
And so that it's a real but then eventually he figures that this absolute idealist position is really just too full of unclarity so he tries to make it clear, and it starts looking like theism, and he becomes a theist, and then he becomes a Christian.
Right.
That's probably not going to happen to Thomas Nagel, but you never know, because something like that happened to Tony Flew.
Right.
Yeah. So who knows? You always pray about that,
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's so hard. It's so hard because I marvel at your mind. I marvel at your ability to speak, Professor. I mean, it's so wonderful. I wish we could stay in this mode forever. We have to shift a little bit here. Thank you for giving us some of the history there. That was fascinating. I know I'm so glad we record these things, because I'm gonna have to rewatch to catch all of that. But we've got a segment here. Ian submitted a good question. So we're going to give Ian opportunity to ask you his question directly, and then give you a chance to respond. So Ian, if you want to unmute, and you want to go ahead and read your question, please.
Yeah, I'll have to read it so I can remember exactly what I was trying to get at. But so, I mean, basically I say, given that defenders of naturalism seem forced either to make these implausible claims, where you've given this example of Dennett saying he has to argue that meaning is indeterminate, or they use self-refuting arguments. The example he gave was the Churchland's argument that eliminativism, and I can't say that very well, is true, means that no one can know it is true. Then given that they have these self-refuting positions, or they're just denying things which seem to be obvious to people, and I'm aware that you mentioned that they use this term folk psychology, which I think is a bit demeaning, really. Is it, well, you may believe that's true and it's the sensible thing to believe, but actually it's just folk psychology, and we may or may not include it in our theories.
Has some interesting implications, because let's say I catch you contradicting yourself, right? And typically in debate and logic, I've got you if I got you in a contradiction, right? But you can come back and say, you're appealing to the law of non-contradiction to get me off my position. I'll have you know that is just an axiom of folk logic. I don't have to believe that at all. I don't have to accept your conclusion. I can contradict myself if I want to, no problem.
But they do seem to hold these some of
them do.
Yeah, so that's what I think I was trying to get to there. So, why do they persist in that position when it seems to? I mean, like this term cognitive dissonance, isn't it? They must be walking around with their heads buzzing all day. But but if they believe, let's say that they believe that abandoning naturalism in that form leads directly to acknowledging that God exists. I mean, I think my question really is there not some kind of intermediate stance that they might take? So maybe.
Well, read Thomas Nagel.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, that's exactly where Thomas Nagel's at. Okay, Thomas. Now, I mean, there are different types of naturalistic positions. You don't. Dennett is really strong. No skyhooks. Mental explanations have to be cashed out in terms of physical explanations, and that drives him to a sort of a quasi-eliminativism about the mind. Churchland, but there are other people who try to use the supervenience relationship, so you can keep everything, and there's no. I mean, that's I think got some problems with it, but that's kind of the typical position. Non-reductive materialism. Then you have David Chalmers, who says, well, maybe the mind emerging is kind of like electromagnetism emerging. And so we don't really need a God to explain, or we don't need anything. It's just kind of built into the physical world that certain things like that are going to emerge. And so that way it doesn't have to be, so we can get out of any implications. But the thing is, you have, to me, you really have the fact of reasoning, I think, drives us to conclude that we have an ultimately rational universe, okay? A universe where what is basic to it is rationality. And the standard description of matter is basically you have laws and facts, and everything just moves mindlessly on. I have a quote from an atheist professor here by the name of Tanner Edis, and he says this: physical explanations combine rules and randomness, both of which are mindless. Hence, quantum mechanics has an important role in formulating chance and necessity physicalism, according to which everything is physical. The combination rule-bound and random processes, regardless of whether the most fundamental physical theory has yet been formulated. Religions take a top-down view, starting with the irreducible mind to shape the material world from above. Physicalism, in whatever form it's shaped, supports a bottom-up understanding of the world where life and mind are results of complex interactions of fundamentally mindless components. But the problem is, if they're fundamentally mindless, doesn't that undercut the very reasoning process on which this is they're basing their position? And that's the claim that I'm inclined to make. Get my Zoom link back up. There we go. Yeah. But but see, there are moderate positions, there are extreme positions, there are positions that try to put in as much of the mental as you can possibly get and say that the common sense view of the mind is okay, but it's just what the brain does.
I was just trying to work out what would be wrong with trying to infer that there's something other than the material, sort of matter or energy. I was thinking in the way that you have this Aristotelian Thomistic view where it's inferred, so it's an abstraction. So man being a rational animal, there must be something which produces that rationality. The Enlightenment just threw out all of those Thomistic kind of viewpoints.
Well,
but
the thing is to get physics off the ground. What the physicists did, the physical as it was originally defined, was basically they made a distinction between what we can describe in mathematical lawful terms, and then how people react to it. And so rather than saying that there is like a taste out there or a color out there or whatever, they said, well, that's not really there. That's just how we react to things. So in other words, they basically modern physics is based on here's how I'm going to say it. Modern physics is based on mind-body dualism. Because it attributes to the mind, it siphons everything off to the mind, what you can't analyze in standard physical terms, okay? And there's a bunch of stuff that it siphons off to the mind, okay? Well, now if you want to say, if you want to then turn around and say, okay, now we're going to extend physics to the mind itself, you're undoing what you did in the first place that got physics going, okay? And so that's why they don't want, of course, the other thing is these Aristotelian forms, this kind of Aristotelian philosophy has, Aristotle and Aquinas, they both, once you start viewing the world that way, they have, they're now become a bunch of arguments for God. You now have to start taking seriously, right?
But it's this idea that you could at least infer something, because it seems to me that modern physics infers things all the time, because it infers the existence of quarks and things like that, which nobody can see.
Yeah.
And
it used to. Back in Lewis's time, the non-theistic view of the world was what supplanted religious views tended not to be actual materialism. That wasn't what people went for. What they went for was a logical positive position that said, well, so for example, what physics describes is potential states of observation. And so if you're a logical positivist, for example, believing in quarks or strings or whatever, that's meaningless talk, because it doesn't reduce to possible observations. Okay. But then around 1950, late 1950s, 1960s, people who were scientific naturalistic thinkers switched from logical positivism to metaphysical materialism. And so when Lewis was around, that wasn't the primary rival. The thing he called it the logical positivist menace, and he said that these logical positivists are coming to the Oxford Socratic Club. They're wiping the floor with us all the time. But a few years later, logical positivism just died.
Yeah.
And it died because it really, if it taken to its logical conclusion, it would have drawn the conclusion that materialism is meaningless, and it would have, and of course it involves the verification principle, which of course hasn't been verified, so that was the, and so a lot of positions that were taken around Lewis's time weren't really materialistic or naturalistic in a metaphysical sense, but then materialistic metaphysics came back, particularly under the influence of J.J.C. Smart, D.M. Armstrong, and by that time, this argument that kept at least Haldane actually ended up deciding, I'm going to be a materialist anyway. Computers are physical systems; they reason, therefore no problem. Well, that's a problematic argument. We can go into that. But these intermediate positions are still out there. They're interesting. I don't know. So that's why I have some hesitation about presenting this argument as a direct argument for God, because, for example, Lewis bought it in the 1920s, and he said, "I can't be a materialist anymore. I'm going to be an absolute idealist."
So could you just explain that idea a bit more, because I'm not really familiar with that.
Absolute idealism?
What would you hold if you believe that?
And then after that, because I love this, guys. I wish we could be here forever. We have one more question after you clarify this point, Professor, and then we're going to be shifting to some current and future research. But yes, clarify that please for us.
Okay.
And then we have a question from Omar.
Absolute idealism is the idea that you have that what is real is really mental. So in other words, it looks as if physics may in fact tell you, may give these analyses in terms of physical law and fact, okay? Where they explain everything, or they assume a chance factor based on quantum mechanics. But that's not ultimately real. That is appearance. And science is very good, they'll say, about hooking up appearances. But what is absolute real isn't this non-mental physical world at all. What is real is this, everything is really the mind of God. It's very much like Hinduism, there's a lot of similarity between Hegelian absolute idealism on the one hand and Hinduism on the other. And it's something that Lewis pointed out in his book Miracles.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, that's a different position. That doesn't, I don't know that gets targeted by the argument from reason. In fact, Lewis thinks that one of the problems with going that way is that if everything is literally the mind of God and all of our thoughts are the mind of God, are actually thoughts of God and not something that God created in us, how do we ever make mistakes?
Right. No, that's so good.
How do we ever goof up? There's an interesting argument in there.
Yeah.
It's kind of tucked away in I think like the 4th chapter of Miracles. You just said, well, I hadn't noticed it before. It took me. I think I just recently was reading this. Well, that's interesting. He's got an argument against. He's got an argument against absolute idealism right here.
Next time we'll bring you on and we'll let you chip away at that one. That's so good. So, okay, Omar, you had a quick question for us before we shift to future research. Omar, if you want to unmute. So the last caller, for those of you who are new to our monthly segment, the last voice you heard was from Ian Davies. Davies is a treasure for us here at Reasonable Faith. If you live in Wales, connect with this man. He's a wealth of knowledge. For those of you who live in the Philippines, my sister-in-law was just out here from the Philippines. And the Philippines just won their first gold medal in the Olympics. Segue, but that was awesome. First time in 100 years. Okay, so Omar is calling in from the Philippines. Go ahead, Omar, unmute and ask the professor your question.
Thank you. So my question is based from this quote. So Anscombe asks, what can you mean by valid beyond what would be indicated by the explanation you give for distinguishing between valid and invalid reasoning? And what in the naturalistic hypothesis prevents the explanation from being given or meaning what it does? So my question is, would you please elaborate more on Anscombe's second objection about paradigm cases versus skeptical texts?
Yeah. Okay. The interesting issue. I've been thinking about it quite a bit lately. Here's the idea, and I bring up that this is in response to this line of thinking, which I kind of the term paradigm case argument really wasn't used in she didn't use it. There was a follow-up piece to Anscombe's essay that was written by Anthony Flew, where he describes the argument as a paradigm case argument. But the idea is this: look, you're saying that if naturalism is true, that all of our reasoning would be invalid, okay? But that's not possible. You would only have the concept of valid and invalid by figuring out how we distinguish between valid and invalid arguments, okay? Or actually valid and invalid reasoning processes, okay? And therefore, it would be meaningless to say if naturalism were true, all our reasoning would be invalid, because what that would mean, because the only way we could have the idea of valid or invalid would be how we make the distinction between valid and invalid, okay? Now, I think C.S. Lewis actually had a concept of valid at work. This is something I picked up from a guy by the name of Gregory Basham, who went back and looked at some of the philosophers from Lewis's time. Now, there's a problem with the word valid in that today, if you take a logic course, your logic teacher may say, here's what we mean by valid, and it's simply the internal rules of deductive logic. Okay, validity is an argument put together in such a way that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. Okay, and that's a distinction that, you know, how could it possibly be the case that everything's invalid if we have these rules here? The only way we have, you know, and some arguments are going to come up valid, some are not. The notion of that is largely a product of a logic text that was originally written in the 1950s and became extremely popular. It was called by Irving Copey. Prior to that time, going back to the 20s and 30s, 20s and so forth, the writings of F.H. Bradley, it states the view that the validity of reasoning is a matter of the idea that our reasoning processes reflect reality, okay? That there is a reality beyond our minds that these reasoning processes reflect, okay? And that's what Lewis meant by valid, all right? That's what Lewis meant by valid. There's a connection between our thought processes and reality. So we can have all sorts of logical language games about, you know, and say, well, this is invalid according to this language game, or this is valid within this language game. But there is an independent question that has to be asked, namely, is this reasoning process actually reflective of reality, or is it something that doesn't reflect reality? And so that's a difference between Lewis and Anscombe. Anscombe's being affected by Wittgenstein here. And it's interesting exactly where Wittgenstein comes down, where Anscombe comes down, because she can't be a complete Wittgensteinian, as I was, I think, talking before class, before we actually met, and I was just talking to Charles and John. she's a follower of Wittgenstein, but she can only take Wittgenstein so far, because with Wittgenstein is a radically non-realist philosophy. I studied under Peter Winch at the University of Illinois, so I know where Wittgensteinism goes. Peter Winch, for example, when he talked about the difference between creation and evolution, the creation story and Darwin's theory of evolution, he said, those are two different language games. There's no conflict between them. Okay, well, and he's following Wittgenstein there. Well, the Wittgensteinian is going to come back and say, whoa, the naturalist is going to scream if you suggest that. And of course, probably the people over at Discovery Institute are probably not going to be too happy with you either, because they're both going to say, now wait a minute, there's a reality out there. Somebody's right about this, it's not, if you read the writings of evolutionists talking about people who follow the creation story in Darwin in Genesis, they get very upset with you if you suggested that they were the creationists are just playing their language game and you're playing yours, right? They're going to say, no, wait a minute, we're getting reality here. Those guys over there, they're in La La Land, believing in the 7-day creation or whatever. We've got the facts. So this language game theory is going to really, so what can you mean by valid? Valid for Lewis means it connects up with reality. Now, I made a distinction. I developed there are two different ways in which you can get this argument from reason going. One is, what kind of world is it going to look like if naturalism were true? What would be true if naturalism were true, or if materialism were true, for example, let's say, okay? And one way of doing it is to say, well, we'd have all what we experience in life is this: people drawing conclusions for reasons, right? Okay, that's what, in other words, it looks as if we, for example, we walk by someone's house, there's a beware of dog sign, there's a dog that's muzzled in the backyard. We notice that the messengers don't show up at the house, this is back to Lewis's example, and we infer that that dog in that backyard is dangerous, right? Now, you can form the belief that way, or you can say, and so if someone asks you, well, is that dog dangerous? Well, why do you think he's dangerous? Well, look at the way people behave around him. Look at how they. Or you can say, or it can be because you were bitten by a black dog as a kid, right? Okay, so in one case, so is that, and in only the latter case is there a real inferences being made. And of course, so when people draw inferences, sometimes we say, particularly if they're giving you what we think are very weak inferences, sometimes you say, there's got to be some ulterior motive why you're drawing this conclusion, right?
Right.
If you're concluding something that's really implausible, and you're hanging on to it, is there, you may be giving me arguments here, but there must be some sort of irrational process going in behind.
Yeah, that describes a lot of my conversations around my house sometimes when emotions run high. So
right.
So
I was just in a conversation about vaccinations recently, and I kind of left with that feeling. But anyway,
yes, exactly. So okay, Professor. So as we come to the last little bit here, we're curious. You made a comment to Charles and I that you had some more current research. I'd love to hear any further development, any current research you're undertaking in this area, and also if there's any implications you can draw for us to how this research has impacted you personally in your faith. I'd love to hear some of those pieces.
Well, it's interesting, the difference between C.S. Lewis and Bill Craig as apologists. Bill Craig is the happy apologetic warrior. Lewis kind of took apologetics on as a wartime duty. When he was debating his faith, he said, when I get through it, when I actually win the debate, I actually start feeling as if the strength of my faith has been drained, because to do the debate, I have to base I act as if my faith is based on these arguments, and they certainly have contributed, but there's also my experience of God and other sorts of things that I have to leave out when I'm debating, and that kind of makes it hard. That makes apologetics hard on one's faith. And he didn't really, I've been discovering he didn't really enjoy doing it all that much, but he felt, because he was an intellectual convert, and because he was good at it, and particularly he was good at explaining things in layman's terms, he felt obligated to do it. But it was not, people think that he went off and did Chronicle of Narnia because he couldn't do it, because he lost the debate and with Anscombe supposedly, and that's it turns out he's really not. He really wasn't an apologist by nature, or so to speak. He's not somebody who's really. I'd like to ask Bill if he has what his experiences are. Just compared to on this issue, because Lewis complains about what happens when he does apologetic with respect to his faith. I'll bet Bill would say is no, that doesn't happen. Yes. I haven't seen anything in Bill that suggests that he experiences it the same way.
Sure,
but
sure.
Anyway, but it's interesting. I've just felt that a lot. I felt that a lot. There's a lot of sort of snobbery directed toward Lewis, and particularly toward this line of argument. And so part of why I was so motivated to write about this, when I was doing my work in graduate school and all this, I felt that this line of argument had been just kind of snobbily dismissed, and Lewis snobbily dismissed. He was very. He actually came this close to being a professional philosopher. If he had gotten a post at Trinity in Oxford, he actually would have ended up being a professional philosopher. I think we're better off that he didn't. We're glad he didn't. He went and did literature. He really is a multi-talented polymath, does all sorts of stuff, And I'm glad that didn't happen. But he was this close to getting this degree, but he didn't want to spend all his life engaging philosophy and doing the apologetic. He thought there were a lot of things he could do. A lot of his apologetics is actually basically expositing Christian doctrine in layman's terminology. So they're both well-known apologists. But they do it very, very differently, and they have very different kinds of careers. Bill Craig but I just get a little annoyed when, I was going through grad school, and I was going through undergrad and particular grad school, and it was like some people come along and say, "Oh, everybody's a materialist." Except those that aren't, right?
Right.
But
right.
They imply that this materialist view of the mind is something you've got to accept. But why do I have to accept it? I don't know. Then the argument, well, isn't it obvious? The sciences will fall apart if we don't accept materialism. Why? Well, why will they? But leading scientists aren't materialists.
Right. And so I'm curious with that view, because I find that very interesting. That distinction you drew between the founder of this organization, Reasonable Faith, Dr. Craig, and Lewis, has that influenced your current research at all? Has any of those thoughts dovetailed into?
Well, I'm doing right now. I'm in the process of doing. I wrote C.S. Lewis's Dangerous Idea 2003. This piece that you have in Natural Theology volume is a follow-up to that, of course. And of course, I've had some changes in Philosophia Christi and a few other places. Philo, actually, before I start, you know what Philo is? That's the Journal of Secular Humanist Philosophy. That was where some of my first essays and exchanges came out.
Interesting.
But I've just been noticing. But to me, I guess what motivates me, as in terms of wanting to do apologetics or wanting to do, is I don't like people being intimidated out of their out of their beliefs. And I think that sometimes happens to people. They end up getting they aren't really giving good reasons to reject what they believe. What happens is, instead, they're just in an atmosphere where everybody, where the smartest people in the room are non-believers. Whoever these smart people are, they're the non-believers, and so that doesn't, they end up saying, well, gosh, maybe these smart people are right, and they stop believing. They don't often they aren't really argued out of anything exactly, except that they're just around better arguers. I had the experience as an undergraduate. I found the most brilliant people I ran into, particularly as an undergraduate, were actually a couple of Roman Catholics, actually, and there were other people I knew that I felt were, at least, of course, that they were undergraduates. My professors were had doctorates, but even among the professors there were a couple of them that were devout Christians. So but I just noticed that a lot of people drift away from Christianity because the other side kind of wins by intimidation. And if you listen to, and so I don't like people, I don't like the other side winning by intimidation. And so that's one of the things that motivates me as an apologist. I want to write about these things. I want to say, hey, wait a minute, this is a neglected good idea. Let's pay attention to it. Everybody seems so sure that in philosophy of mind that materialism is true, but they have arguments against each other's position. If you add them all together, they undermine materialism in general. So this is just the sense that people have in philosophy, that somehow, let's say, a non-materialist view of the mind, for example, is sort of the cliff that we want that if you start getting over in there, then you're kind of falling off a cliff. That's the sort of thing that bothers me, and that's right. Where I think, I had to think about it too. I mean, I was in grad school. I had to think about, well, wait a minute, are they really believing this because there's a really strong case for it, or are they just dismissing positions that are, is it functioning as a kind of dogma almost with a lot of these people? And that's I think where Dennett comes from.
Right.
He's really he really accepts materialism as dogma, and then sort of says, okay, now what can we conclude given the fact that we've got to be materialists?
Right.
And then what he ends up with is a bunch of stuff where basically it's like I think Thomas Nagel wrote a review of a Dennett book, and he says, well, basically what Nagel is saying, well, what are you going to believe? You were my the old Groucho Marx line, who are you going to believe? You or me or your lying eyes?
Right.
Yeah. Well, in other words, just things I directly experience as a human being. I experience myself as a reasoning person, as someone who has consciousness, who has, and that there is a self, right? There is I experience not only do my neurons fire when I'm in pain. There is this experience of the awfulness of pain. All that stuff there that looks like it's part of what it's as real of the world as physics is. Physics is so confusing. It's
right.
I mean, you talk about a mystery. I mean, if you think the Trinity is confusing, ever read string theory? You know?
Yeah, no, I mean, and it gets that way. And for me, I'm so encouraged by you sharing these pieces. And I remember earlier, you had alluded to some current research on some of these things, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on some of those pieces, or in the last 5 minutes, if you had something specific.
Basically, David Kyle Johnson. I was in a debate with David Kyle Johnson in a debate book called C.S. Lewis's Christian Apologetics: Pro and Con, and he throws a bunch of stuff. There's a bunch of stuff, arguments that he has. He's very critical of my lines of argument. He's almost dismissive of everything, I think. But I've been working through, for example, he raises the issue, well, what about naturalists that aren't really materialists? A naturalist, of course, the define naturalism is really complex, because naturalism is defined by some people as something defined in terms of the methods of science and reductive analyses of everything, but it can also mean just, well, we're not going to put God in there. Okay, but then maybe you put other stuff in there. The problem is that the stuff you try to put in there, if you have followed out logically, kind of makes atheism difficult to hold. So that's the kind of exchanges I have. I've been studying an essay by Peter Van Inwagen, where he says that Lewis doesn't refute the naturalist. I think he misinterprets Lewis somewhat in that essay, and I think of course the question, there's a whole line of argument. There's been, it's kind of overlooked. Brendan Rickabaugh and Todd Boris wrote a reply to Peter Van Inwagen that's also very nice. They're interesting arguments about the whole issue of mental causation is very interesting. For example, it looks like the way causes and effects run, if the world is really physical, then it looks like mental stuff doesn't really explain anything. For example, suppose I'm an opera singer, and someone comes and I tell my friend, you see that glass up there, I can sing out the word shatter now, and I can make it shatter. So I can tell that because I'm a great opera singer, I can tell that glass what to do, and it'll do what I say. And I sing out shatter now, and it breaks. Okay. But does the content of shatter now actually cause the breakage? No, right? Doesn't cause breakage. So when we reason, if materialism is true, do our reasons cause our beliefs? Or is it more like the word shatter now? I mean, you could say, I could sing "Don't Shatter Now," it would shatter on me, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that what we enjoy about doing these installments, once again, if this is your first time joining us for the recording, the brilliant man you hear speaking is Dr. Victor Reppert, and he has done a lifetime's worth of work on the mind and reasoning. And before we close, Doctor, as a final question, I just love for you to tell us where we could keep up with readings and materials, just real briefly, where people could go if they want to keep up with current reading materials.
You want to, one big source, important source is William Hasker's The Emergent Self. He develops the argument before I actually, he and I were center fellows at Center for Philosophy of Religion in 1989, 1990, and of course that Center for Philosophy is run by Al Plantinga. Al Plantinga is another source. He has somewhat a different epistemology from what Bill and I have, I think, but he thinks that the real conflict is not between religion and science, it's between naturalism and science. And that's he wrote a book called Where the Conflict Really Lies. And he makes that argument, and it's something along the lines of the argument from reason, although it has, I say, a somewhat different it has more an externalist epistemology than what Bill and I use. Bill Hasker. There is a couple of YouTube videos, one by Bill Hasker, one by a guy by the name of Jim Slagle, and one by me. It's on Parker's Pensies. This guy by the name of Parker Settecase interviewed all three of us on this line of argument. So, and so all three of those discussions kind of fit together. Another source that you might want to consider is there's a YouTube debate. I believe it was on Unbelievable. It was between a Oxford philosopher by the name of Max Baker Heitch. I believe that's the way you pronounce it. And his opponent named himself Cosmic Skeptic. And it's also on that argument, and it's available on Justin Brierley's website. Justin Brierley does the I believe Unbelievable broadcast, and that was an interesting debate. There's a lot of just sources on the internet, I think, that you can use. I have a blog, but of course I talk about all sorts of stuff on there. Right. For a while there, I had a blog. I used a blog that developed where I was just doing the argument from reason on it, and there's some interesting discussions on that one, but I haven't been on there for a long time. I tried to go back on it, and nobody seemed to be wanting to follow me over there, so yeah, I didn't do that. Let's see what else there's out there. I mean, there's that. If you can lay your hands on that debate book on C.S. Lewis's Apologetics Pro and Con, that's very good. There's that issue in Philosophia Christi. There is an issue of Philosophia Christi where I have an exchange with William Hasker, Keith Parsons, and Theodore Drange. Wow. Parsons and Drange are atheists, and Bill Hasker is basically a supporter of the argument. So that's Philosophia Christi 2003. And that's kind of contemporaneous with C.S. Lewis's Dangerous Idea, which is still in print. Right. It's 2003, and it's still they're still cranking it out. I still get a little check every year from University Press because they're still putting the book out.
As you should. And let me just say, I have a new goal in life. I have a new goal based on what you just did. I hope that one day someone will ask you about resources, and you'll remember this talk, and you'll reference this Reasonable Faith recording. I think today was.
So this is getting up on YouTube somewhere.
It is. You will be on YouTube again when I am done with this. Okay, so I'm so excited for today. Once again, this is if it's your first time joining us, this is the Reasonable Faith International Directors book study. The voices that you heard: Ian Davey out of Wales, Omar is a director in the Philippines. We are so blessed to have these intellectuals, and we hope that in the future we'll hear more callers, more questions. But that is going to wrap it up for today's segment, and I am just hoping that you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. Until next time, bye-bye.